gillnets being used as the primary mode of fishing. So that's sort of what we would expect. Now, in this period of time, fishing for the totoaba was extensive, and actually that fish itself was labeled as an endangered species and forbidden from fishing. Unfortunately, switching off to gillnet fishing was impacting another animal in the upper Gulf. And that fisheries practice, even after the vaquita, the totoaba went endangered, that fisheries practice of using gillnets continued for other fishes as well as shrimp in that space. So we have the next slide. Yeah. So people always exist within ecosystems, and that's the important part to remember, that as we talk about the different species today, and as you have questions today, I just want to remind everybody that you can use the text number 562-286-1838 to ask any of your questions, and I'll be happy to answer them as we go along. And if you're not live watching this, you can always email us at live@lbaop.org. That's live@lbaop.org. So communities grow, they develop, we get technology, and over time in the upper Gulf, we have over 30,000 people who rely upon fisheries, export fisheries, for their primary subsistence. That's the major economy in this space. Maybe 80–90% of the economy is reliant upon these fisheries, which aren't for local consumption, but are actually shipped out to the entire world. First it was the totoaba, and then later on it was shrimp that was exported, and that's where we see these communities develop. But people always exist within these ecosystems, right? So there are vaquita, there are totoaba, there are whales, there are dolphins, there are sharks, there are sea turtles, all existing within this space. And it's that whole space, including the people, that we have to think about. And unfortunately, the method of fishing that's predominant all over the world is gillnet fishing, and unregulated or underreported gillnet fishing can create a huge toll. Now, in the upper Gulf, it's illegal gillnet fishing right now that's causing the biggest problem. And this is a totoaba whose swim bladder has been removed. And right now, it's that illegal trade in totoaba swim bladder that's causing a population decline for the vaquita. We can see in the graph behind me here, I'll step out of the way, that there's been a precipitous decline in the last decade or so, several decades, to an estimated population today of only about 9, which is really tragic. We've gotten just to a place where there are so few left. There's still hope. We can still solve the problem, but we have to dig deep and really think about what the root causes of those problems are. And that lies in that interrelationship between the people and the ecosystem. We have to solve that human problem in order to solve this ecological problem. So what do we want to do? We probably want to ban gillnets. People should stop fishing with gillnets, and that's what we all celebrated in 2015 with a comprehensive gillnet ban for the entire range of the vaquita. But what that led to was almost an entire collapse of the economy of the upper Gulf as well. This is when we visited San Felipe, right on the tail of that gillnet ban. We see is unemployment, businesses closed down, all of the different connected economies that were part of that fishery were also shut down. Now, alternative livelihoods and alternative fisheries that used gear that wouldn't entangle vaquita is one of the critical components that was missing in this relief effort. While fishermen were getting paid to not fish, the development of new economies, of new alternative livelihoods, lagged behind that ban. And that created a challenge between the local community and the environmental concerns that we all have and shared with that community, and the community shares with us. But food, shelter, school for your children, general prosperity is deep in the minds of the fishermen of the upper Gulf, and providing for their families was a paramount concern. It's a paramount concern for all of us. So how do we manage all of these things together we really needed to do a better job with thinking about the human side of the issue and really working on that. It's not to say it wasn't happening, but it certainly didn't work. If you have questions, again, use the text number below. We needed to do more of what we're seeing here. Sitting down, talking to fishermen, solving those human issues, because people, while they are part of the problem, they're always part of the solution. And if there's a take home that you can bring out of this, is if you're thinking about conservation, you should always be thinking about how do we change the human behavior and allow for people to have prosperity in those regions along with the conservation that we're looking to aim for. And if we're able to do those two things, the synergy of those two things is what provides us with those solutions. This is a great example of how that's actually being successful in the Upper Gulf. We were able to work with local fishermen to really support the science of understanding the population of vaquita and how it was declining and where their population centers were. And that was all because of the integral work of a small group of fishermen, admittedly small group of fishermen, but really dedicated to the cause of preserving conservation for all species in the Upper Gulf, but in particular for the vaquita. And this is something you can look on our website to learn the stories of these gentlemen here that we see. You can learn all about that on our website in our conservation section called Storied Seafood, if you want to learn a little bit more about that. So one of the things that you might be interested in is to say, okay, if there's so few left, is there something that can be done to bring vaquita out of waters in the Upper Gulf to protect them and to keep them out of harm's way while we solve this human and ecosystem issue that we're seeing? And an effort was taken. This effort I mentioned earlier called Vaquita CPR. CPR stands for Conservation, Protection, and Recovery. And this was an effort to get out into the waters of the Upper Gulf to find the remaining few vaquita that existed there and to bring them into protected sanctuary. So just to take a break here for a second and talk about one of the questions that have come in. What jobs are dependent on this certain type of fishing? So that's an excellent question. So we think about fisheries, we might think about people on boats in waters with nets or hooks and lines, catching seafood and bringing them back for us to eat. But then we also have to think what happens after that. We have in the Upper Gulf, those pictures that I showed you, there were restaurants, there were retail stores selling the shrimp, so that's a job as well. There are packing plants, people who make ice. Now we got to think about the boats. They need maintenance. We have mechanics. We have the people who work at the gas stations that fill up the boats. All of those things are connected in that economy. So while fishing is the main initial source of income, they're attached to all of these other jobs in that space. So that's an excellent question. And so when you ban fishing, you also take away all of those other parts of the economy that are connected. And that's what leads to that mass effect of really looking for new ways and alternative ways of generating income, especially in the Upper Gulf when there are so few options. So speaking of just a few options, one of the options that we had was trying to collect vaquita out of the wild and to bring them into protected sanctuary. And we tried that. This is an individual that was collected in the Upper Gulf during Vaquita CPR that was released because it was showing signs of stress. And in our work with the vaquita during Vaquita CPR, we found that vaquita just cannot handle the stress of being collected and brought into human care. And unfortunately, during this project, we actually had one vaquita die in this process. And at that time, it was just shown that this would not work. We couldn't do this. And those efforts were abandoned. But what we learned about this was we needed to know a whole lot more about the biology and the physiology of vaquita way earlier on in this process, back when there were maybe thousands of animals, not just 15 left. Vaquita CPR was a last-ditch effort to pull animals into protected sanctuary when we knew very little about their biology and their physiology, all of those things. So we have now some lessons to learn. We got together as a group and that's that ESOCC community, ex-situ options for cetacean conservation. Now, ex-situ is a word that means protected care. So ex-situ conservation is human conservation, human intervention in conservation. And we got together as that group to say, okay, this is what happened with the vaquita, so how can we take the lessons we've learned from that and apply it to new species? We met in Germany, we came up with a plan, and we met in a few other places in the world to look at other species and how we can learn and apply lessons from the vaquita to those species, or learn from them on how to apply these principles to other species around the world. And the first one I want to talk about is the Yangtze finless porpoise. So we traveled to Wuhan, China in November of 2019. Yes, that Wuhan. Right before this whole crisis started, I was in Wuhan to work on species conservation for the Yangtze finless porpoise. And this is a picture of us that met together to work on this, and that's me right there, just to prove I was there. And what we were working on really is to learn from the Chinese about how they've adopted conservation to keep a species from going extinct in the Yangtze River. We have the next slide. So we have two animals to talk about here. The first is the Baiji river dolphin. Unfortunately, this one is extinct. And it was during an expedition on the Yangtze River to count the remaining few Baiji river dolphins, and if any were found, to potentially try to collect them and bring them into protected sanctuary like the vaquita. It was found that they were gone, that there were no more Baiji left in the Yangtze River. And at the same time, populations of these finless porpoise, which, take a look at them, aren't they cute, were declining as well. And today, there are about 1,000 Yangtze finless porpoise swimming wild in the Yangtze River, but that number was declining rapidly at this time, and something had to be done. So the Chinese conservationists, they stepped in to do something about it at that time, much like we tried to do at the very end for the vaquita. So there was a question here that came in: how many vaquita are currently left in the world? You'll see a lot of different numbers thrown out there, but somewhere around 9 individuals. Less than 19 for sure, and maybe as few as 6. But if you had to take a number and guess at what the population would be, it would be around 9. The good news about vaquita is that vaquita are often spotted with calves. So they are living, even in the small population, right in and around San Felipe, and they are reproducing. So if we're able to figure out the problems in the upper Gulf, then we would see the vaquita bounce back. So we see what can happen with species recovery when we think about the Yangtze finless porpoise. Now, what the Chinese did was they had these resources along the Yangtze River called Oxbow lakes. They're parts of the river system of the Yangtze that used to be connected to the main stem of the river where these porpoise live, but they've become disconnected. So the ecology of these spaces is essentially the same as the river. And through a lot of effort, a lot of research, and a lot of really hard work, Chinese conservationists at the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation figured out how to bring Yangtze finless porpoise and put them in these Oxbow lakes. And this is what they look like. We can see one here. There's a really good picture of one jumping up out of the water. But primarily when you see Yangtze finless porpoise, this is what they look like here. And I think I have some video to show now. So this was us in rural China, a few hours outside of Wuhan. And that is a pod of finless porpoise living in one of these semi-natural reserves, Oxbow reserves, and breeding in these spaces. So successful conservation in China. We will not see a repeat of the Baiji river dolphin. The Yangtze finless porpoise will not go extinct, and that's because of these conservation efforts that were taken at a time before there were just too few left to really figure things out. And all along the river now, we have a series of conservation reserves that have been set up specifically for the Yangtze finless porpoise so that they can thrive in these spaces. At the same time, though, there are efforts being made on the Yangtze River to eliminate fishing practices that were causing the decline in the species. So for 10 years, there's a ban on all fishing on the entire length of the Yangtze River, which is one of the largest rivers in the world. Now, just to put this into context, there are about 400 million people that live along the Yangtze River. Now, you can imagine taking the whole of the United States, the whole population, at a time when we're not doing physical distancing, and if we were to put them along the Mississippi River, that's sort of equivalent to the population that lives on the Yangtze. So you can see how that population might be impacting those species. But we're seeing this effort showing that there's a way that we can work with people and species to conserve and prevent biodiversity loss. The Yangtze finless porpoise will not be lost. So we have a question: is there any way to bring back the Baiji River dolphin? And unfortunately, there are no Baiji River dolphins left to bring back. They are extinct. There are some reports that maybe one is here or there, sort of like Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot reports. Is it possible that there might be one swimming around? Probably, but their populations are so small right now, there really is no possibility of bringing them back. So that's a lesson we need to learn. And that was in 2008, not that long ago. One of the things we have to remember too is not many people know about these species. You might be learning about the Yangtze finless porpoise right now for the first time, or the Baiji River dolphin right now for the first time. And these are species that are on the brink of extinction. These are marine mammals, dolphins, things that we really love. And we need to do a better job as conservationists and as societies to really make known the challenges of biodiversity loss that we see in our world, and to do something about it, like we see here in China for the Yangtze finless porpoise. It's another shot of a different Oxbow reserve. So they're looking at all of the different tools that they can apply. This was a system that they were thinking about doing reintroductions. This one was connected to the main stem of the river in certain parts, and they have these gates that they're creating where they're thinking about staging releases of Yangtze finless porpoise back into the main stem. So really thinking about all of the tools in the toolkit. So that's another lessons learned. We can't limit ourselves to what we can and can't do for species conservation and biodiversity loss. We need to really think about all of the tools in the toolkit and develop our strategies, especially for these critically endangered species. When we do that, though, we're not just saving Yangtze finless porpoise. These semi-natural reserves are important places for Pierre's David deer. This is a deer that was nearly extinct itself and now thrives on these Oxbow reserves. Traveling through China, one of the things I noticed was really a lack of birds just out and about in a very cultivated space. Like every inch of the land and the road that we were driving by was cultivated with farms and fish farms and agriculture. Not a whole lot of wildlife or space for wildlife. So these Oxbow reserves provide space for these wetlands birds here, but just innumerable other species of fishes and birds and mammals like these Pierre's David deer. That's what we get when we establish these reserves for a species like the Yangtze finless porpoise to prevent biodiversity loss, but we get ecosystem gains by doing this. And again, all of the tools, successful breeding, not just in the semi-natural reserve, but in net pens within those reserves. And then the next slide here is of a facility that they had designed initially for the Baiji River dolphin as a breeding program, but now houses and is breeding Yangtze finless porpoise. So we can learn more about their biology and physiology. And I think I have a video to show you here of them swimming around. So as we see, I mean, you're just being introduced probably to the Yangtze finless porpoise for the first time. But this is a species that, how could we imagine this not existing on our planet right now? This is an amazing species. It's incredible that we've come to the point where we need to take these efforts to preserve them, but it's shown that you can do it. If you do all of the work necessary, biodiversity loss can be accomplished, biodiversity loss can be stopped, and we can do things positively and proactively to solve these problems. So I want to talk about one more species. We have just a few minutes left, and that's the Franciscana dolphin in Argentina. This is another small coastal cetacean. We met in Argentina in November, early November, and there I am, among a bunch of other really amazing people, to think about a species that isn't in dire concern, but is dropping in its population, and that's the Franciscana dolphin. Populations today are about 20,000, but they're declining at about 1,000 animals per year, and that's documented. So we don't know about undocumented animals that have passed on. And unfortunately for the Franciscana, they're also tangled up in fishing gear, gillnets in particular. These are a small coastal species. They live within a few kilometers of the coast, and they eat small fishes and things like that. There's a video that we can see. This is a video taken up in Brazil. The population of Franciscana lives along the coast of South America from Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. This is a drone footage. I'm trying to get my best weatherman here, try to see if I can point at them. They typically live in pretty murky waters. Now that looks like pretty clear water, but you might have seen just one just pop up here. It's got really low visibility. Franciscana dolphins, they are very similar to river dolphins. They're actually among the same group of animals that we see living in the Amazon River, but these live only in coastal marine environments. And because they live coastally, let me get out of the way. They come in contact with both small fisheries, artisanal fisheries, as well as commercial fisheries, all using gill nets. And if you have questions, 562-286-1838, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So gill net entanglement becomes a huge problem for these species, and that's what's causing their decline at about 1,000 animals per year. But we're at a point in time where we can really think about jumping in and doing something at an earlier stage, like we should have done for the Vaquita, and like the Chinese have done for the Yangtze finless porpoise. We're at that point for Franciscana dolphin. Right now, we're learning about their physiology, about their biology, by doing tag and release studies, and that's some really great work from Randy Wells and Leo Barris, I'm not going to pronounce his name, from Aqua Marina, and they're working with local fishermen to think about how to change gear types and to put pingers on nets and things like that. Pinger's a little thing on a net that makes a noise that the dolphins can avoid so they don't get tangled up in the net. And they're having success at working with the fishermen, alongside the fishermen, to develop fisheries that are less threatening to these Franciscana dolphins, which you can see are really tiny. That's somebody's hand holding on to the head of one of these guys. So pretty incredible. But we have learned that they can survive handling, that they can thrive even after being tagged, and that bodes well for the species and our possibility of bringing them into that semi-natural reserve like the finless porpoise. So that's something that we should think about. Why are we talking about these things? Well, I'd mentioned 2 species, but all of the species on the list next to me are species that are threatened with declining populations because of interactions mainly with fisheries that use gill nets in coastal waters. And all of these species that you see here are declining in their populations. Now, there are thousands of animals left in most of these that you see next to me. But this is the time that we really need to invest in thinking about these species, some which you probably have never heard of, and what we can do to protect them. But why are we talking about dolphins? What's so special about dolphins? Why not talk about the endangered sea cucumbers and coral reefs and other things that are out there in the world? One of the challenges that we see is just a challenge of life history characteristics. Cetaceans are slow to grow and slow to reproduce. We're seeing an emergent trend in species loss and biodiversity loss in the ocean, and it's starting with those species that are long-lived and slow to reproduce. Those are the ones that are most impacted by by the declines in their populations. We see it not just in cetaceans like these ones you see here, but also in species of shark and ray. Wedgefish, this different group of shark or ray that we see in the world, as a class of organisms, are universally very endangered. And that's also because of accidental catching in gillnet fisheries as well as targeted fishing. But primarily, the reason for their declines is because of their slow growth, long-lived species that don't have a whole lot of babies. So we see those declines in these species as well. So that's my presentation for you today. The lessons learned and making sure that we engage specifically with our communities and our populations to establish prosperity for those people as they engage in these conservation issues, to start learning about species and working with communities at a time when it doesn't become so dire, that we have some time to figure out some of these problems, like when we look at the Franciscana dolphin. But we should be thinking about this for humpback dolphins, Irrawaddy dolphins, and all of those other species that you saw on the list, as well as sharks and rays. If we can create these semi-natural reserves, marine protected areas where species can thrive, then we can work alongside communities for equal prosperity for both ecosystems and for people. So thank you so much for joining us today. We have one last question here. What is the most threatened marine mammal? And the most threatened marine mammal would be the one we were talking about just first today, the Vaquita porpoise, with somewhere around 9 animals left. It is one of the most endangered animals in the world, if not the most endangered marine mammal. So something for us to think about as we move forward in all of this. And thank you so much for joining. This is a passion of mine. I look forward to sharing these kinds of things with all of you watching, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of our live online programming and on-demand programming here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Thanks so much.